Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
They told me they couldn't help with my tuition on a Sunday afternoon that smelled like pot roast and lemon polish. My father sat at the end of the table, glasses perched low, tapping his fork against an empty plate as if buying time before saying what he already knew I wouldn't take well. Karen, his wife, my stepmother, had that calm, careful tone she used whenever she wanted to sound fair but feel superior. She said, "Honey, it's just that things are a little tight right now. You're independent now. It's time to spread your wings." And that was supposed to be comforting, as though independence was something I could put on a credit card. I tried to hold a neutral face, because crying would have only made me look dramatic. The words "tight right now" echoed in my head, while my eyes drifted to the sparkling new bracelet on Karen's wrist, the one she'd posted about on Facebook just 2 days earlier. I said I understood, even though my throat was dry and my stomach had gone cold. I'd been accepted into a state university, nothing fancy, nothing out of reach, and I'd saved what I could from working part-time. But I'd counted on their help to fill the gaps. It was supposed to be a family effort. My dad looked almost relieved when I said I'd figure it out. "That's my girl," he said with that hollow grin of his, like it was a moral victory for me to pay for everything alone. A week later, I was scrolling through social media during my lunch break when I saw a photo that made the sandwich in my hand taste like cardboard. Emily, Karen's daughter, was standing in front of a brand new house, keys in hand, caption reading, "New beginnings." Couldn't have done it without my amazing family. Behind her was my dad, smiling proudly, arm around Karen, champagne in his other hand. The caption didn't mention tight finances. It didn't mention sacrifice or independence. Just a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage and a manicured lawn that probably cost more than my entire degree. I remember staring at that photo for a long time, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe they co-signed, maybe Emily had some inheritance I didn't know about. But the longer I stared, the more I realized there was nothing reasonable about it. I'd been left out, quietly and deliberately, and the realization wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. When I finally worked up the courage to call my dad that evening, he sounded cheerful. He told me about Emily's big step and how proud he was of her for wanting stability. When I asked him directly if they helped her buy the house, there was a pause so brief it could have been mistaken for a bad connection before he said, "We gave her a little boost. You know how the market is these days." A little boost. That phrase ran through my mind like static. I asked him if Mom's college fund, the one she set up for me before she passed, was still intact. He cleared his throat and said something about using assets wisely and family decisions. That was all I needed to hear. I ended the call politely, said I was happy for Emily, and hung up before the tears started burning my eyes. I spent that night pacing my apartment, replaying every family dinner, every polite dismissal, every small way I'd been made to feel like a guest in my own father's house since Karen and Emily arrived. I remembered how Karen always referred to me as "your daughter" when talking to my dad, never by name, as if saying it would imply responsibility. I remembered the way Emily had laughed when she called me the scholarship kid at Christmas, not realizing or not caring that I didn't find it funny. The next morning, I went to the university's financial office and signed up for every extra work-study program they offered. I took a second job waiting tables at a diner that smelled permanently of fried onions and burnt coffee. I told myself I'd make it on my own, that needing help was weakness, that I could turn bitterness into drive. But late at night, when I came home with sore feet and grease in my hair, the image of that perfect family photo still flickered behind my eyelids. Then came the dinner invitation, Karen's attempt at smoothing things over, though she would never admit it. "We haven't seen you in a while," she texted, followed by a heart emoji that made my stomach turn. I went, partly because I wanted to show them I wasn't broken, partly because I needed to see their faces when they looked at me. The house looked like a catalog, soft lighting, floral candles, everything matching, everything curated to scream success. During dinner, they spoke casually about Emily's mortgage rates and kitchen remodel plans, as if I hadn't overheard my father complaining about money just weeks earlier. When dessert came, Karen smiled and said, You're doing so well for yourself, Maya. We're proud of how independent you've become. I almost laughed. Independent wasn't the right word. Abandoned felt closer. I nodded, thanked them, and excused myself early, saying I had a morning shift. As I stepped outside, I caught a glimpse of Emily's car in the driveway, brand new, spotless, another boost, I guessed. Driving home, I realized something sharp and quiet had settled inside me. It wasn't rage, not anymore. It was a kind of cold resolve, the sort that doesn't announce itself with shouting or tears. I didn't plan revenge that night, not consciously. But somewhere between the neon diner lights and the hum of my car's old engine, I decided I'd stop hoping for fairness from people who never saw me as theirs to begin with. Still, one thought wouldn't leave me alone. My mom's fund had been meant for me, a promise from someone who'd believed I was worth investing in. If that money had gone into Emily's perfect little house, then every brick of it carried my mother's name, and I wasn't going to let that stand forever. I didn't know when or how, but someday they'd learn that nothing built on someone else's sacrifice lasts forever. I learned quickly that exhaustion has a sound, a faint metallic ringing that lives just behind the ears and comes forward every time the swing door of the diner snaps against your hip while you balance 3 plates of pancakes and a pot of coffee that never seems to empty. And in those nights I discovered that when you repeat the word independence enough times it begins to taste like dishwater, which is perhaps why I started narrating my life in long sentences to myself as if I were building a rope out of words strong enough to pull me through until sunrise. While my classmates discussed internships and spring breaks and group projects that wrapped up before dinner time, I set my alarm for before dawn and biked across town to the campus tech lab, where I earned just enough to keep the lights on. And when the lab closed, I slid into a black apron and worked the late shift beneath fluorescent bulbs that made everyone look a little sickly and a little honest, because it is hard to lie to yourself about the shape of your life when your feet ache and the register is short and the manager asks whether you have been rounding down on tips that were never generous to begin with. Between the lab and the diner, I checked my phone the way a person checks a bruise, knowing it will hurt and pressing anyway, because my father's timeline had become a parade of domestic victories that marched past my eyes like a well-rehearsed band. And every image of Emily's house glowed with that smug newness that smells like plastic wrap and tax deductions. There were photos of a shimmering backsplash that looked like fish scales, a farmhouse sink deep enough to bathe a Labrador pendant, lights that made their kitchen look like a cooking show, and a counter lined with cheese boards labeled with chalk pens, as if the very word cheddar needed a chaperone. I put the phone face down and told myself to be a decent sport, but I am not a saint, and the truth is that I laughed, not kindly, when I saw the staged shot of Karen in a silk blouse holding a wine glass in a way that said, "Please notice the ring, the bracelet, the life." Because there is a meanness in me that flares when someone uses the word family like a coupon, and even a little meanness can keep a person upright when sleep and pride have both gone missing. Some nights I caught myself planning a conversation I would never have, a calm and steady interrogation about my mother's college fund and how such a thing could be bartered away under the heading of family decisions. And in these imaginary conversations my father became reasonable and remorseful, while Karen softened into someone who understood that fairness is not the same thing as convenience. Then the ticket printer coughed out another order of hash browns with extra onions, and the dream evaporated like steam off the flat top, leaving me with the bill of particulars I carried in my chest like a folded paper cutout. They had chosen Emily. They had chosen ease. They had chosen a version of love that cost me my dignity. In the middle of that winter, when the sidewalks were salted and the air hurt to breathe, the university notified me that I had been awarded a small emergency grant named after a retired librarian who used to sneak granola bars to students during finals, and although the amount barely covered my textbooks, it felt like a hand on my shoulder that did not immediately let go. I decided then to perform what I told myself was a petty act of grace, and what I suspect was also a pointed message, because I set up a tiny monthly donation in my mother's name to the same student emergency fund, a sum so small that no one sensible would brag about it, and I wrote a note that said, in careful script, that it was given in honor of daughters who pay their own way, after which I listed my father's home address for the acknowledgement mailing because philanthropy, even when it is pocket-sized, love stationery. When the first thick card arrived at their house embossed with the university seal, my father texted a photograph of it with a question mark, and I replied that some houses are built out of more than boards and loans and that maybe this card could hang on Emily's stainless steel fridge as a reminder that not everything that sparkles belongs to her. It was not a kind response, yet it steadied me, and if virtue needs a little vinegar to preserve it through February, then so be it. The very next week, as if the universe wanted to underline its sense of humor with a bright marker, the diner hosted a realtor luncheon that overflowed with talk of appraisals and rates and starter homes that sounded suspiciously like Finnish lines. And when a woman at the end of the counter began bragging that her firm had secured an appraisal bump in my father's neighborhood by staging properties with borrowed furniture and conveniently absent disclosures, I felt the penny drop in my gut. Because the address she said out loud was the same street as Emily's, and the picture that formed in my mind was not flattering, I asked a few friendly questions in the tone I reserve for customers who think the refill is free because they are charming. And by the time I cleared the plates, I had collected enough careless details to confirm that the housewarming fairy tale came with footnotes written in small print. That night, instead of crying or writing another unsent email, I opened a spreadsheet and listed every recurring charge my father had once agreed to cover for me in the name of parental support phone insurance. The modest stipend he swore would last until graduation, and I canceled each one he had already stopped paying without telling me, then redirected the remaining accounts to a prepaid plan in my own name. After which I changed every password attached to my cloud albums so that the family slideshow Karen loved to display on the big screen would now feature an elegant sequence of black squares titled Access Revoked by the Scholarship Kid, a gesture childish enough to make me snort tea through my nose, and yet mature enough to feel like hygiene. When my phone buzzed near midnight with an unknown number that turned out to be Emily, whose voice carried the brittle confidence of a person who has never waited tables and never will, she asked whether I knew anything about online storefronts because her brand new website kept crashing and the lovely woman who designed it from a template had stopped answering messages. I stared at the ceiling where the streetlight drew a thin white bar like a final underline, and although a part of me wanted to let the silence ring until she hung up, another part of me felt the pull of a door I might choose to open, because sometimes the cleanest revenge begins with a very polite yes that arrives a little too late to be convenient. And as I told her I might be able to look tomorrow, my laptop chimed with an email whose subject line referenced a legacy account number I recognized from an old envelope with my mother's handwriting. A coincidence so sharp it sliced my sleep in two and left me staring at the glow, wondering who had touched what that was never theirs to touch, and how far they had gone before they decided to call it love. Graduation day arrived with the pale stiffness of a pressed shirt that never quite fits, and as I pinned the square cap with its ridiculous tassel and tried to coax my hair into something that didn't announce sleeplessness, I told myself that walking across a stage without a cheering section was just another version of what I had already learned to do. Because for years I had practiced crossing rooms where affection had been replaced by polite weather reports and walking back out as if nothing vital had been misplaced, and that small performance had made me good at standing alone in loud spaces. The auditorium smelled faintly of carnations and floor wax. The brass band bled into the rafters. 2 rows behind me, a group of nursing students traded snacks in crinkly bags that made me think of the emergency grant and the retired librarian, and somewhere above it all the lights picked up dust motes that drifted like exhausted confetti, which felt about right for a celebration I had primarily funded with blistered palms and a stubborn refusal to go away. When the dean's voice settled into its ceremonial rhythm and the first wave of names rolled across the microphone, I looked at the empty seats in the family section where my father once promised to clap until his hands hurt, and I swallowed the irritation that rose like heartburn when my phone buzzed with a picture of Karen and Emily on a beach that was not ours, sunlit drinks held high with the caption, "Family first, always," and I pretended not to care that the words were untrue because the walk was mine and I had no intention of sharing it with people who treated love like a coupon with an expiration date. The night before, after a week of dodging calls and then finally letting one of them slip through, I had agreed to glance at Emily's online shop, not because I wanted to play rescuer in a story that had never given me a speaking part, but because professional curiosity and a certain sharpened malice are cousins who exchange favors when no one is looking, and if there is a tidy way to harvest both justice and tuition money from a single harvest, I am the kind of farmer who will bring the right tools. The site was a fragile confection of borrowed templates, heavy scripts, and aspirational branding that looked pretty on a phone and suffocated on a stressed laptop. And within an hour I had traced the crashes to a careless plug-in cocktail and a discounted hosting plan that throttled resources every time someone refreshed a page, which meant the problem was not witchcraft so much as a bad diet. I proposed, in a voice sweet enough to leave no fingerprints, that I could migrate the storefront to a stable platform, rebuild the theme from a lightweight starter, set up a real database with backups that didn't vanish at dawn, and place everything under a managed account in my own technical umbrella so that updates, security patches, and payments would not depend on whichever hobbyist designer decided to ghost them next. The price I quoted was market rate with a ruthlessly professional retainer, payable in advance, with a clause that transferred the domain to my registrar for the duration of the contract, a clause that is industry standard, a clause that has saved many a small business from itself, and a clause that, incidentally, placed the keys to Emily's kingdom in my pocket with her signature on the receipt. Karen did the negotiating, all brutal efficiency and a tone that assumed I would be delighted to work for exposure, and when she asked for a family discount I replied that I was already giving one, because I was willing to take on a client whose brand aesthetic required the word artisanal 3 times per paragraph without charging a surcharge for emotional discomfort, after which I sent the invoice, watched the payment clear, and built the thing correctly, quietly and to my own exacting standards, adding a sane caching layer, setting up a fraud filter, writing a tidy little status dashboard that Emily could understand without calling me during dinner, and leaving behind a maintenance portal that bore my company name in small letters like a watermark that cannot be seen unless you know where to look. I did not break anything. I did not starve the site to make a point. I simply built a proper machine and kept the wrench, which is the kind of revenge that tastes like professionalism and spends like tuition. On the morning of the ceremony, while I stood in line behind an engineering major whose mortarboard read debt-free because Mom, my phone pinged with a sale notification from Emily's store and a terse text from Karen that read, "It works now, thanks," which is as close to gratitude as certain people can travel without a passport, and I replied with a link to the monthly support calendar and a note that the rate would increase after the first quarter, then slipped the phone into my gown pocket as if I were tucking away a small, well-fed future. After the walk and the obligatory handshake with a stranger who smelled faintly of cologne and old money, I stood on the steps outside and let the spring air remind me that lungs prefer honesty to ceremony. And I snapped a photo of myself in the gown because records matter even when witnesses forget to show. Then I sent a copy to the emergency fund office with a thank you that named the retired librarian and mentioned my mother. After which I forwarded the same photograph to my father with a simple line that said, "I did it," and a link to the site's uptime graph, whose neat green line marched across the screen like proof that building things to last is a skill that runs in families even when care does not. He did not respond, although the message showed as read. And perhaps it is uncharitable to say that his silence sounded like a man who had just realized that the daughter he left out of the budget now controlled a small, but important lever in the household economy he thought he owned. Maybe it was only bad timing or poor reception or the absence of courage required to type anything true. That evening, while I returned the cap and gown to the rental office whose clerk congratulated me with the tired warmth of a person who says the same blessing 100 times a day, my inbox blinked with a new message from a credit union I did not use. Its subject line an innocuous cluster of words about annual statements for a custodial education account, which, if you have ever opened mail after months of pretending the past is a myth, you know can rearrange the contents of your chest faster then caffeine can rearrange your pulse, and as I stood on the sidewalk with the envelope icon glowing like a small lighthouse, The wind pushed the tassel against my cheek in a gesture so oddly gentle that I almost laughed. Because even the weather sometimes tries to steady you before the floor moves, and I tapped the screen and watched the body of the email bloom into a scanned page that carried my mother's name, my own, my father's signature, and a ledger of transfers that did not belong to any graduation I had ever earned, and I felt the careful mechanism I had been building shift into a new gear as I pressed my thumb to download the attached documents and told myself, in a voice as patient as steel, that I would read every line before calling anyone at all. Years had passed with a quiet accumulation of skill and small victories that no one in my family seemed to notice, and during that time I built a career that moved steadily, almost imperceptibly, from contract work into full-time IT management, until I was in a position where companies relied on me not for my patience, not for my willingness to accommodate small errors, but for my ability to foresee where systems would fail and to intervene before the failures became disasters, which was a skill honed in the crucible of having to survive on tips that never quite covered rent while watching a stepmother and her daughter live in a world that seemed to exist in parallel to my own, a world of new homes, staged dinners, and celebrations that I had paid for indirectly with every hour I spent studying instead of sleeping. It was during one of these ordinary mornings, the kind when sunlight falls on the office carpet at just the right angle to make dust motes glitter like careless stars, that my phone rang with my father's name on the caller ID, the same name that once delivered words about tight finances and little boosts, and I hesitated before answering because I had rehearsed conversations with him that never would have happened. Conversations where the truth was laid bare in tones calm enough to allow listening, and when I finally pressed the green button, the voice I heard was not the one I remembered from childhood, but a voice frayed at the edges, dulled by worry and the stress of a company whose ledgers had begun to tilt dangerously toward red, a company that bore my family name and once seemed untouchable in suburban prestige, but now rattled on foundations I had long suspected were weaker than they pretended to be. He spoke cautiously, a careful avoidance of blame wrapped in sentences meant to signal humility, asking if I could take a look at some of the systems, implying that it was merely a technical review when in truth I knew that the gravity of his request could collapse the entire company if handled improperly. And the subtle trembling in his voice betrayed the fact that he had reached the end of avenues he felt comfortable with, and so I agreed, not out of pity or forgiveness, but because I needed to see for myself how the people who had left me to struggle now found themselves dependent on the skills I had honed in the absence of their support. When I arrived at the office, the familiar smell of aged paper, printer ink, and lingering air freshener seemed almost ironic against the sight of folders stacked haphazardly across desks that once appeared pristine in family photos. Folders labeled with contracts, invoices, and bank statements that connected every corner of their financial life to decisions they thought inconspicuous, and as I traced each entry on the computer, my eyes landed on a familiar account number, one that belonged to the college fund my mother had set aside for me before her death. And as I scrolled through the transactions, I realized in growing disbelief that those funds, which should have been invested in my education, had been used as collateral for loans connected to the very house Karen had purchased for Emily. A house that had once seemed a symbol of ease and entitlement, but now revealed itself as a silent monument to the disregard for my presence and contribution. The revelation struck with the force of years of accumulated betrayal, not as an emotional explosion, but as a cold, precise clarity that allowed me to step back and consider the options I had. Options that were not available to my father and stepmother because they had spent so long believing that authority and affection were interchangeable, that money could be measured in gestures rather than obligations. And as I reviewed the ledgers and cross-referenced payments with legal documentation, I found myself in possession of a power that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with the inevitability of accountability, and in that quiet office, surrounded by fluorescent lighting that had long since ceased to flatter anyone, I realized that revenge need not be noisy, and that the kind that is patient and strategic leaves no doubt in the mind of those who once overlooked you about the consequences of their decisions. Karen attempted to explain, using a careful tone that assumed incompetence rather than malice, that the fund had been reallocated for strategic reasons, that Emily's security was paramount, and that my role as the forgotten child had been, in some inexplicable way, a choice I had made by not asking, by not asserting, by leaving them free to define my place in their narrative. But her words fell on a quiet determination that had been years in the making, and as I closed the statements, printed copies in hand, and prepared to leave, I realized that the subtle leverage I now held would not require confrontation, that their desperation would meet with measured silence, and that the same patience I had learned waiting tables, commuting between jobs, and balancing tuition against rent could be applied here in a legal and meticulously documented form that would allow time to serve the final verdict. The drive home was quiet except for the hum of tires on asphalt, and as I passed familiar intersections and the distant shimmer of Emily's house came into view, I did not feel the old ache of envy or betrayal, but rather a calm recognition that the architecture of my success was built in private, invisible to those who had underestimated me, and that the very hands that had once been forced to earn every dollar alone now held the subtle control over outcomes they had never considered, outcomes that required only patience, discretion, and the quiet application of knowledge that had been forged in the absence of family support, and in that moment, I understood fully that power is often silent, justice slow, and revenge most effective when it arrives wrapped in the ordinary routines of a life finally lived on one's own terms. The day I decided to step away from the noise of expectation and the subtle pressure of appearances, I realized that the house that had been purchased for Emily with what should have been my mother's foresight and support no longer held power over me. And as I approached the suburban street, lined with maples whose leaves had already turned the color of dry gold and copper, I felt a calm that was unfamiliar but precise, a calm that had been built over years of labor, patience, and quiet observation, because in the absence of family care, I had learned to recognize the small truths hidden beneath gestures of love and the invisible weight of debts repaid in sweat, not inheritance, and as I walked past the manicured lawn and the polished front door, I knew that my presence, unannounced and unnoticed, carried more consequence than the house itself, a consequence no one could quantify except in the subtle rearrangement of fortune and responsibility that I had orchestrated without fanfare or declaration. Inside, the air smelled faintly of new wood and polished granite, a smell that once would have excited me or inspired envy, but now merely reminded me that beauty and comfort are hollow when they are purchased at the cost of fairness and the erasure of someone's rightful place. And as I traced my fingers along the wrought iron rail of the staircase, imagining the laughter and chatter that had once seemed so vibrant on social media posts and staged photos, I understood that the house had always been a theater, a backdrop for performances in which I was never cast, and that the real story was the quiet accumulation of skills, the careful attention to detail, and the unwavering patience that had allowed me to become indispensable in the lives they had assumed were secure. When the phone rang that morning, it was my father again, using the tentative tone of a man who senses that control is slipping but cannot articulate the extent of his vulnerability. And he asked if I could verify a few details regarding an account tied to the house, details that would have been trivial had I not already understood how their finances intertwined with my mother's legacy, and as I reviewed the statements, recalculated interests, and traced transfers across banks and ledgers, I recognized that their carefully constructed security was dependent on my discretion, that their entire illusion of ease relied on someone they had once dismissed, and that the power I now held required only my measured action or inaction. Because the system they had abused was entirely transparent to someone who had been forced to see every angle of survival from the bottom up. I did not call back with reprimand. I did not send a legal notice. I did not demand apology. Because revenge, I had learned, is most devastating when it is delivered in silence. When consequences arrive without warning and without the dramatics that allow pride to brace itself, and in the quiet hours that followed, while they scrambled to untangle overdrafts, interest payments, and the cascading effects of collateral that had been tied to my mother's intentions, I maintained a careful detachment, observing rather than intervening, knowing that the lessons they had overlooked in their treatment of me were arriving now unadorned and unmediated, and that the house, the symbol of all that had been taken from me, would now serve as a marker of their own misjudgments rather than a measure of my absence. When Emily called later, frantic over financial complications she could neither explain nor understand, I answered with a composed voice, offering guidance but no favors, enabling only the clarity she had never been taught to seek for herself. And in that restrained intervention, I observed the full extent of what years of oversight and misplaced trust had created: anxiety, frustration, and the realization that the ease she had enjoyed was fragile, contingent on my restraint and willingness to remain unseen yet fully competent, a paradox that left her uncertain and unprepared. And for the first time I saw the house not as a home, but as a testament to selective generosity and the illusion of security. Months later, when the house was listed for sale and the agents spoke in measured tones about depreciation and market timing, I walked past it on a morning when frost had collected on the front lawn, the rising sun turning the roof to dull copper. And I felt no satisfaction in watching the sale unfold because the real victory had never been the collapse of their financial choices, but the quiet assertion that my life had been constructed on principles they could neither buy nor manipulate, that my independence was not granted by them but forged in every long night of labor and careful calculation. And as I continued down the street, leaving the property behind, I carried with me a freedom they could never encroach upon, a peace born from clarity, and the understanding that true justice does not require spectacle, only patience, precision, and the unwavering knowledge that those who once measured love by convenience will ultimately measure their own losses by the absence of respect, which cannot be bought, borrowed, or staged, and that in this absence I had finally arrived at the place they could never purchase, the quiet certainty of having built a life entirely my own.